Hi, you're listening to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively brings insights from the Indian space activities ecosystem. I'm your host Narayan, the co-founder of India's first space-focused think tank, Spaceport, Sarabhai. Guests on the NewSpace India podcast help you understand space activities-related macro and micro trends within India in all aspects, including space history, local industry, space science, technology evolution, law and policy, art, and more. The NewSpace India podcast is supported by Dassault Systèmes, a global leader in providing businesses and people with collaborative virtual environments to enable sustainable innovations. Dassault Systèmes Solutions supports startups, small and medium-scale enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launchers and satellites. Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today we have Dr. Dibyendu Nandi here, who is one of the very well-known people in the space science community in India. I know Dibyendu for several years now, and he is doing some very interesting work. We'll go into the details in the podcast. But firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to speaking with me, and I look forward to exploring this topic on how to get more space science done with more of an innovative hardware-oriented approach with you in this particular podcast.
Thank you, Narayan. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As you said, I've known you for a long time. I have known about this podcast. I've listened to this. Thrilled to have this opportunity to speak today, and hopefully we'll have a nice conversation. Looking forward to it.
You have a very interesting case. Started out in India, went to the US, did a lot there before you came back to India again. Often I see a lot of people in the space science community in India, especially due to maybe the lack of volume of opportunity or even maybe the funding, they tend to remain in the US, obviously, when they get out. You're one person who has actually come back. You've been working with all the solar magnetic cycles and all this research that you're doing on space weather in India after having returned and also having spent time in places like Harvard and Smithsonian. So what is the motivation for somebody like you to have come back, and what was your thought?
So maybe this is going to sound a bit mundane, but I was educated by this country in the sense that I did my schooling, my graduation, my PhD, and my education was funded by taxpayers of this country, including probably your parents, my parents. Everybody was paying taxes. I did my PhD in Engineering of Science. I got a reasonably okay fellowship that allowed me to get by. And then I moved to the US, which is typical career trajectory for most scientists, where you do a PhD in India, and if you do well, you go abroad for a postdoctoral tenure, wherever, typically Europe or US. And I was fortunate to be in a fantastic group at Montana State University, the solar physics group, which was started by Loren Acton, who himself was an astronaut and a solar physicist, and remained there for a long time in the US. I worked primarily with various NASA projects. I was also, as you mentioned, a visiting scientist for 3 years at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. We had a daughter in the US, and she was, I think when she was about 4 years old, we decided to take a leap and move back to India. I think our primary motivation for doing that was that we wanted to give back something to this country because my education was funded by this country. We also wanted our daughter, who's an American citizen, to grow up in India and then make an informed choice of wherever she wants to settle down. And also, frankly, I think that I sometimes get a little bored when things are a bit easy, and it seemed that I was getting the grants and I was pretty happy, and the typical lifestyle that was settled in the US, it all seemed very comfortable, and I wanted to challenge it and see what I can do in a different environment. And so we came back to India, and then within a few years of coming back, I was lucky to have landed this big project from the Ministry of Education, which was known as the Ministry of Human Resource Development at point in time, which allowed to establish the Center of Excellence in Space Sciences in India, which I head now. I'm associated with the Physics Department of the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Kolkata. And I have been able to contribute to the life of the career trajectory and life of many students. I have had 10 PhD students, many more undergraduate students. And that has been to me a closure in the sense that I've been able to give back in training others and imparting to them the knowledge that I have gathered through my travels around the world. And that's, of course, immensely satisfying. There are, of course, issues that we'll probably discuss of working in India as we move on. But this one thing that is absolutely a pleasure is to be able to give back to other students.
So it's a very interesting story that you mentioned, and I guess you having the faith of coming back to do something is also very interesting. And obviously, very select amount of people probably have that courage to do something like that. Obviously, you have been in India for quite a while now. What has it turned out to be? Has it turned out to be that you expected? Is there things you saw as particular roadblocks that can be solved, which you can say that these are the top things that needs to be resolved based on the experience that you've had in the last 10 years or so? And it'll be interesting to hear any thoughts around these.
Here, you really have to rely on the generosity of somebody being able to push your case, or having somebody, in your good books to make things happen. This has been a constant source of irritation, and more importantly, results in a loss of efficiency of the workforce. And this is really system wide. And I wish that is one of the things that we could change in our work culture and bring in more professionalism. We don't really need to spend 12 hours at work. You can spend 8 hours at work, but do your work that you're supposed to do without really anyone having to push you. And this is something that is really missing, I think, in the Indian ecosystem.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that you mentioned. Obviously, this spills over to the larger culture. But then when you come to a sector like space science or so on, the organization of how it is being done is different in each country, right? Because in India, I think the nuance of trying to build an actual mission or launching it is dedicated to ISRO. But then when it comes to building an instrument to test something, that's when scientific institutions who are in the physics and the science of all of this stuff, they get involved, like in AstroSat or other areas. But then how does this compare to other places? So what do you think is the setup that India has with respect to doing experimental science or using satellites for science that is running in India versus other countries? What are the pros and cons?
All right. So first of all, I think I cannot really speak in a very informed way about Europe and the European Space Agency because I have not really spent much time there. But I can speak about the US, certainly. Before I go to space agencies, let me talk again about a little bit about the culture in academia, the culture of innovation. I think one major thing that Americans value is being able to build things with your own hands. And I bring in this thing about culture over again because I think this really eventually also transcends to more nuanced or more complex activities like space science. You would find an American fixing their own toilet if something goes wrong, fixing some lights or their own flooring. And this was and their own car. And this was an eye opener to me when I settled down in the US, where suddenly when you are forced to do many things with your own hands. And this actually transcends to academia in the sense that if you build an instrument, if you build something that has a value as a patent or something that is hands-on, which helps to solve a problem, real world problem, that is really valued. As opposed to here, where often I find that if there's somebody who's built an instrument, it's not easy to build an instrument, putting in 4 or 5 years of hard work and labor. Whereas there's somebody who, let's say, is a competitor and has not built anything but has published, let's say, 10 scientific or technical papers in the same time. This other person is more valued because he has publications, and this other person has nothing else to show other than an instrument that he has built. But in the US, on the other hand, this person who builds a novel instrument is equally valued. And this is a culture that I think we lack in India, starting right from the grassroots all the way up through academia. And I think the impact of that is actually felt today in India not having innovative industries, also to some extent in the space technology sector, in the defense. And we are dependent to a large extent on exports in these sectors. Of course, ISRO benefited from the sanctions for a while, and that forced us to reinvent ourselves as instrument builders. So ISRO is still one of the best scientific organizations that can build things which flies. So having said that, let me also talk a little bit about the ecosystem and how science instruments that fly, space science instruments are built in the US and compared to what happens in India. So typically in NASA, so as far as science instruments are concerned, NASA doesn't really build that many things as far as science instruments are concerned. They really are more of in the mode of external university PI led mode for a long time now. This has been built into their ecosystem. where they advertise openly a mission of opportunity, and multiple different universities bid different kinds of science instruments that they wish to fly. And then this goes through a rigorous, very rigorous screening procedure, which can sometimes last through multiple rounds of across 2-3 years before a final go-ahead is given for building an instrument. And that instrument is actually built in some lab, in some university, which is not in NASA. And what does this do? This, first of all, this system, having existed for decades now, has created an ecosystem of instrumentation and instrumentation specialists or scientists and engineers across various universities in the US. There are multiple gazillions of universities in the US which can build space science instruments for NASA, which can build ground-based instruments for the National Science Foundation. And they're pretty mature groups which jump from one mission. When it's over, they jump into another mission, and they're there. And this ecosystem is sustained within the university systems, right? That ecosystem it exists only in a few institutions in India, but it is, and I can count those institutions, non-ISRO institutions, perhaps with all the fingers in one hand. And for a country of 1 billion people, much larger than India, with many universities, that's just not good enough. So we have not created that ecosystem where we enable expertise and innovators outside of specialized government agencies like ISRO or DRDO to build and develop instruments. This, in my mind, has held back innovation in instrumentation across various disciplines, not just space science, in India. And I think this is something that the government has to really look into very closely, in the sense that the job of space agencies is to fly missions, is to create a sort of a basal ecosystem which keeps the system well oiled. But the best innovation cannot come from a well-structured government organization that is charged with keeping our space ecosystem, the engineering ecosystem, well-oiled and well-heeled. It can come from assimilating outside culture of innovation and creativity, which happens in labs, which happens in universities across the country. And this, I think, is something that ISRO must and the government must very closely look into, in how to assimilate other universities, other institutions, and build up an ecosystem of innovation, catalyze this ecosystem of innovation across the country. Otherwise, you're not scaling up. You're not going to be able to the developed nations in any way. And in fact, other countries like South Korea, China has already caught us up and gone much beyond. They were nowhere in the 1970s. We are much ahead of China in space sciences. They've caught up and gone well beyond, and South Korea is doing fantastic. It's doing very well with the instrumentation ecosystem. The other countries like Taiwan, Singapore, which are now catching up. Even so, we have to be open to these challenges that are coming to us from other countries right in our backyard. And I think a big reason of this is that we have not valued innovation. We have not valued people who can build instruments, people who can actually go out and sell their instruments to the industry. Innovation, a lot of innovation also happens there, because that's the ultimate test of a useful thing. I mean, you go to walk into a hospital, forget space science for a moment, because I think that it really is universal. What do you see in terms of the high-end instruments? Go into a lab in India. What do you see in terms of the high-end instruments? They're all made abroad, right? Now, of course, you cannot reinvent in 1 year or 2 years. It takes time. But I think one needs to pay attention to this, that we need to catalyze this innovation across the country, in labs, in various institutes and universities, to be able to match up to the sheer scale of what other advanced nations have now gone into.
One of the things that you mentioned here is, with respect to capacity, I think a lot of people realize this. From a practical perspective, we see some space science missions come out. I think the most popular one recently is AstroSat, for example. But maybe 10 times or 100 times more number of practical instrument missions that are being flown from like NASA and so on, right? So where is the bottleneck? Is it because there are not enough funding opportunities to do instrument building, or is it because there is funding available and there is not enough engineers and scientists who are able to build instruments? Or is it because there are funding available for instruments and there are people available who are building instruments, but there is not enough flight opportunities? What is the landscape for such actual instrumentation science?
Since you brought up AstroSat now twice, let me also comment a little bit on AstroSat. I think AstroSat is one of the most successful Indian space science missions that has been. And the interesting thing about AstroSat really reinforces what I've been talking about. AstroSat is primarily an external PI-led mission where most of the instruments were actually built by other institutions, not ISRO. So this is something that should also inform us that it's important to assimilate the creativity that exists outside of ISRO into the ISRO ecosystem. AstroSat has other good things going about it, in the sense that there is a data center which is maintained at IUCA. The data has been made open to the public, and pretty much everybody with a little bit of know-how and maybe some training can utilize the data, which has really made access to the science from the AstroSat mission much more, I would say, inclusive. And this has resulted in a large number of papers from the AstroSat mission, which I think, to my knowledge, a mission from ISRO, Space Science Mission, has been able to match. Now, coming to what are the bottlenecks, I think it's a mix of two elements that you did speak about. One is funding, the other is lack of human resource. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, in the sense that because we have not created this human resource over a long period of time, and we have not valued people who can build instruments, we don't have that many people in the country that can actually conceive and build an instrument. We don't have that many universities and institutes in the country which have the requisite in-house technical facilities, instrumentation labs, to be able to build space science instruments. Only a handful of institutions have that. And this has been a challenge. It's tied to funding. It's tied to funding because often funding is given out to well-held groups which have already proven themselves. And the funding is somewhat risk averse, in the sense that you have to pretty much prove to whoever you're pitching the ideas to that your instrument is going to be able to absolutely deliver before it's funded. And that is a bit of an issue, because that, to my belief, that kills innovation. Because often when you're creating something new, a challenging instrument, you may fail. But the point is, if you don't, let's say 60 failures, we'll not have 40 success stories, right? So this has been a funding issue, in the sense that we have meager funding for space science in the country, and the funding is given out in a very conservative manner. So therefore, we are not really investing in failures, in creative ideas, which in principle can 10 years, 20 years down the line, build this ecosystem in multiple different places. We learn from failures. And this chicken and egg problem has been holding us back. As far as launch opportunities are concerned, I don't think that's a limit. I think ISRO has enough launch opportunities. It's launching satellites from other countries. It's both for both space science missions as well as private sector satellites. So ISRO has enough launch opportunities, but I think the funding is one of the issues, particularly funding innovative, creative research and setting up instrumentation labs in various different institutes and universities. That's number one. Number two is a lack of talent in engineering discipline. For example, let's take an example of my own institute, or a typical institute like ISC, ISER, which is a general science institute, but not necessarily meant to do only space science or astronomy. It's very difficult for us to hire and keep an engineer dedicated to space sciences. As long as you have a mission, you're working as part of a mission, you can hire somebody on contract and you pay them. And then when the instrument is built, the institutions are averse to hold on to this talent. And this is a big challenge for us, and you understand this, it's the same in the industry. When once you train a talent, a human resource, put in a couple of years to train this person, and you lose this person after one job is done, you have a setback, in the sense that you have to start back from scratch when you're trying to build something new. First of all, this person may be completely lost to space science, may go to a completely different domain. Second is it increases the turnaround time of anything that you're building, because you see, we are working primarily with students and engineers who have to retrain and keep on training right from scratch every time we're building a new instrument. And both of this really hold the ecosystem back again.
Yeah, I think what you are saying is fascinating. Obviously, this reflects the reality that you see on the ground as well. But the mention of funding that you say, that then is primarily tied to who becomes the funding institution and what becomes the funding mechanism. Now, when you compare this with what ISRO does, it's a very interesting comparison that you can do, right? Because even ISRO in its case is telling the government why we should be funded, whatever, 10,000, 20,000 crores a year, and is making a case for it. And they are getting success year on year because their budgets have been rising at 10% on a compounded annual growth rate cycle, almost, let's say, for the last 20 years or so. And they're able to do it because they're able to convince end users in the government itself to say that we will provide some solution to the Ministry of Agriculture or so on. And through that, their program planning division is able to tell what a particular satellite costs and how many launches it needs and what a launch vehicle costs and what research in engines or new age engines or new age satellites will cost and so on. So they're able to make that case. But in your case of this community, there's no one centralized body, right? That is then like ISRO, who is only dedicated to space, who can then do it. There are institutions are spread out between AA, IUCA, your center, and many other institutions. Is there a institutional overhauling for funding that can reflect on the success of ISRO in getting funding that can be built into the space science landscape?
So that's a very interesting thought, because so there are some specialized astronomy, space science institutes like India's Astrophysics, to some extent Research Institute. Of course, ISRO has its own institute, a research laboratory, which is doing pretty well. So I will not talk about PRL because that's still part of under Department of Space. But let's talk about India's Astrophysics. So India's Astrophysics is funded by DST, and given that one of the mandates of I is to actually develop astronomical sciences, both ground-based as well as space-based. NewSpace Astrophysics manages to attract DST funding to build infrastructure for laboratories which can sustain space science instrumentation, which can build space science instrumentation. Now, this is the same doesn't hold true for institutions like ours, which is much more of a general science institute, or for example, Institute of Science or other places where the mandate is much more broader from the Ministry of Education, right? So I think that eventually, therefore, if you are in a place like Institute of Astrophysics and you want to do space science, or PRL and you want to do space science, you are certainly at a distinct advantage. But then you have these 2-3 institutions, right? Which is still just simply not enough. It's not even like a bare minimum to sustain an ecosystem. So therefore, to really create this ecosystem across multiple other institutions, and you see, the specialized institutions only have astronomers, right? Primarily. They don't have physicists, people who have expertise in optics, electronics, chemical engineers, right? Like for example, what exists in Institute of Science or many other places like ours or other institutions like IITs, right? How many IITs have a space science ecosystem? The Madras is doing well, but in the sense of private industry, through startups, right? So to have them get there, I think it would be actually very useful to both for ISRO to look at this much broader institutions which are a potpourri, a hot pot of expertise from different branches of sciences and engineering, and nurture centers of innovation and excellence in these places, create laboratories which can tinker with space instrumentation, not just for space science. I'm not limiting myself to space science now, but to any kind of instrumentation that is for the benefit of humankind, anything that benefits the private industry, that benefits public good. You can do that. There was talk of a National Science Foundation in analogy to the National Science Foundation of US for National Research Foundation in India. Some developments happened towards that, but now it seems to have hit some doldrums. I'm not aware where it stuck, but that was supposed to create a countrywide ecosystem of sciences, starting from the very basic fundamental sciences to applied sciences, by pulling in funding from different agencies and being one overall umbrella of funding science. So the competition is equal across the board, which would have made the competition much more fairer also. So that something like that overarching umbrella for funding sciences in the country, as well as ISRO taking a deep interest in creating centers, departments, much like what the ISRO Space Science Technology Cell had, the role it used to play, but again at very few institutions across a much larger scale, is something that is certainly, I think, the need of the hour.
Now, does it make sense that ISRO has a specific budget that it requests the government for space science outside of its institutions like PRL or the Space Physics Laboratory in VSSC, that it can use in a NASA type model where they would call for proposals for instruments to be built with a certain, let's say, budgetary limitation, perhaps to accommodate different types of payload at a certain price point and certain delivery? And would that be a kind of a model that can perhaps give a little bit more catalyzing spirit to all of this?
Yes, certainly. I think that is absolutely necessary because you see, NASA recognizes, this is fundamental, this recognition. NASA recognizes that creativity and innovation doesn't exist only within its own walls. It exists anywhere within the shores of its, borders of its country, United States of America, right? And it's willing to put in the money to assimilate that expertise, creative ideas from any other university or academic organization, or in fact, even private industry players from across the country. This, I think, is extremely important. Now, having said that, ISRO has opened up recently in the sense that ISRO has this call for proposals for funding very specific items that it needs. It wants the private industry as well as outside players to pitch in with their expertise to build, develop different components of instrumentation that it feels that it needs to plug in holes in its own, that are gaps in its way of progress. But I'm in two minds about this approach. In the sense, it's all right to do that because I think it's important that when you're trying to build a chain, you have a chain of innovations you need and you have a certain link missing. You want to assimilate that from outside. That's good. That you have opened up, you're honest to admit that you don't have that, in opening up to get that expertise from outside. But you should not limit yourself there. You also have to be much more open to completely new disruptive ideas which you have not thought about, which is not a missing link in a chain that you have envisaged. You should also be open to assimilating a completely new idea, completely new chain of innovation, a whole new instrument concept that somebody else somewhere sitting outside of ISRO has thought about and is willing to put their time in developing. You have to bet on those ideas as well. It's just like angel investing, right? And you would understand that, right? So ISRO needs to get in there and it needs to convince the government. And I hope the government would listen to ISRO when ISRO says that, yeah, I want to scale up and involve other universities and institutions to nurture innovation across the country. I would hope the government should have open ears and open mind to massively scale up ISRO funding for achieving this innovation. By using the existing ISRO setup of proposal judgment or whatever it is, but yes, to try and involve the whole country. I think that is absolutely essential. This is not just essential for ISRO, for academic institutions. If you sustain this innovation in various places, we're also creating expertise who we can feed in to the private industry. And NewSpace India is now rapidly growing. NewSpace India needs expertise, people who can build. And I'm sure that you also probably understand that we have a clear lacuna there, shortfall of human resource who can actually build and develop stuff, right? Starting from small components to engineering a satellite bus. We don't have enough expertise to do that across the country. Our industry will need that at some point in time.
Yeah, the one thing that a lot of people talk about is this triad of industry, ISRO, and academia, for example, or research laboratories, including academia. It's thought about always from an idealistic standpoint. People think about it that, there should be synergies between all three, but there's no practical implementation of anything there. People think of it from an idealistic standpoint, but there is no real project that involves all three together that is ever done to a large extent. And what you said brings to my mind to saying that if that would be a mechanism where ISRO says that there is a budget that it can get from the government to support science instrumentation, but it could also be that this is one of the ways in which you can really create that triad, right? Because if you say that the instrument has to fit in a certain size, certain power profile, certain temperature requirements or attitude requirements or communication requirements, and you limit even to involve the industry or incentivize local industry to develop IP and to develop small platforms, that ISRO does the selection of the vendors and the research institutes who are doing science, the vendors from the industry, to build a small mission. And that is a great triad that can be built, right? Because if somebody says your instrument should fit in a 50 kilogram satellite of a certain profile, and the budget for this is, I don't know, whatever, 2 crores, 3 crores together. And that is a fascinating triad that you can then build to extend.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's something that I have been very deeply thinking about. I've been talking to some people about this, of establishing such centers which are funded by the institute, where it's by some public agency which is funding that institute or ISRO, and private players who come in to build things which currently don't exist in India, or which we don't build but export from other countries, connected to space sciences and space instrumentation. I will use that interchangeably. When I say space sciences, to me, science and technology is the same thing. One cannot exist without other. Science is enabled by technology and vice versa. So there is a huge advantage here. Why is that an advantage for everybody involved? Let's talk about the institution itself. The institution, by this mode, manages to attract some external funding, manages to work with the space agency or whatever is funding this, and a private player or a bunch of private players who have come together in creating what we have been talking about, an instrumentation ecosystem for space science and technology in their campus. This benefits their students. So the students normally would have theoretical courses, some lab courses perhaps, but there is nothing like building something which is new, okay, hands-on, which is going to fly, which becomes part of even a component, which becomes part of a new overall setup that is going to fly and which is going to help the country or ISRO achieve something which it could not have if that instrument did not exist. So you're creating a trained human resource in that particular domain. Now, the students usually come cheap in the sense that they're either funded by the government, the fellowships, or they pay a tuition fee, which is not very much because much of the infrastructure is funded by the government. So this benefits the private players as well. Why? Because by virtue of this training of the students, you are now creating a future set of human resource for many of these private entities or even government entities. They can join ISRO, they can join, not everybody can join ISRO, eventually it's a limited setup, right? But if we eventually do have the NewSpace India ecosystem grow up to be big and successful, you need a lot of people. And so you manage to get to train them for cheap through via an academic institution, but you have eventually in your hand a very nice, intelligent human being who's trained to do the work that you're interested in, right? Without having put your money into training that person. So that's good from the industry side as well. Why is it good for the side of, let's say, ISRO? As I said, ISRO has eventually, it has finite boundaries. It's a limited organization. It cannot do everything, right? It cannot sustain a big boom in space science and technology or space industry in India alone. It needs to have, let's just go beyond ISRO. I think India needs to have this, right? Something much bigger. And it is in ISRO's benefit because ISRO gets to launch stuff. And ISRO has, by virtue of being the Indian government's primary space organization, often the first right to this technology as well. And it has played a role in nurturing and catalyzing this talent, the growth of this ecosystem within India. I think these are all for ISRO. There is no shame, I think, in nurturing ecosystem beyond your own. As a researcher, I want to give up all my knowledge that I have to my students. And if they do as well or better than me, then I have been successful. That's how I gauge myself, right? And this is how government-funded organizations should be gauging themselves, right? We are non-profit agencies because you're funded by the government. So it's your duty to be able to nurture the Indian ecosystem. And I think everybody gains here, as I said.
In your mind, let's say if we have to do something immediate and which is practical and it is the lowest hanging fruits that you think that can be implemented today, what are those lowest hanging fruits? So let's say whatever, some policymaker who's keen on understanding this is listening into this conversation and they want the most practical lower hanging fruits that can be done on an immediate basis. What would that be?
Okay, so there is nothing really immediate in the sense that you can't solve this problem in 6 months or 1 year, but let's start planning about this, right? Okay, first of all, what you want to do is you want to really plan on what you want to achieve. Do you want to be just enough to sustain India's need in space? Let's just say that's the basic minimum that you should aim for, right? 10 years to 20 years, you should be able to sustain what India hopes to achieve in space, right? What can be a more ambitious goal than that? You want to figure out what does the world aim to achieve in space in the next 10 to 20 years. And then you ask yourself the question, can India get a pie of that? How does India see itself as a global player, as beyond a regional player which is just providing some launch services, making some money out of this? Can you actually nurture the ecosystem? Can you build new innovation such that the world flocks to you, like what's happening, let's say, in Europe, or what's in Netherlands, in Germany, what's happening in the US? Can that happen here in India? So here there's some deep thinking involved, which positions your ambitions. That's something that one must do, right? One must create a task force to think of where do you want to be, because eventually, unless you have a dream of where you want to be, the rest is inconsequential because you'll never get there. All right, let's now come down to a more ground level. What can you do to plug the holes? And I think ISRO is getting there with this recent proposal where you really need to understand what is it that, from now to the next 5 years, what are the technologies that are lacking that we need to either get from outside or we simply can't hope to achieve just within the ISRO ecosystem or the DoD ecosystem. So identify those and then you throw it up. You throw it up as open challenges to academicians and the industry. Fund them if required. There is a risk, of course, always, right? Because you have not achieved this in your 50 years of existence. You can't hope that some other entity will come and achieve this in 1 year or 2 years, right? So you have to be patient. Give them 5 years. Give that pot of money to multiple different fund 3 best proposals from the industry, academia, who would bid for the same stuff. Do this for every little thing that you think are critical for in the way of your success from 0 to 5 years as a space agency in meeting India's needs. And then pick up what works best, which company or academia has done best in 2 years down the line, and handhold them, give them enough funding to see this through, technology through, and then assimilate it. Now, the 2 ways of doing this, one way of doing this is with massive oversight from ISRO, which is a terrible thing to do. The other way to do this is, and this sounds weird, but this is the right way to do it. You fund them for the first 2-3 years and leave them alone. That's where creativity best works. Okay, once you know that they have got somewhere where they see the light at the end of the tunnel, then you scale it up, give them massive funding, and ask them to deliver. But too much oversight, trying to get them very quickly into your existing ecosystem that you already created, which is 50 years old, is not a good idea. You want to create centers of innovation, let them be. I think this is of fundamental importance, and I hope both ISRO and the government realizes that. Sometimes you just give the money and forget about it. I think this is what has happened mostly to, for example, SpaceX, right? It's operating mostly out of government money, NASA money, right? But it's creating fantastic for the US. This needs to happen here also in India. I'm not saying create that one big thing. No, create an ecosystem of multiple different companies who can plug in these holes that exist right now. Now, what is the best way to do this? When you have a completely new thing to invent. The academic organizations have nurtured years and years of nurturing of talent. Something that you want exists inside somebody's mind somewhere in India. Either you don't know it or that person doesn't know that his mind is going to be useful. So you really need to throw out this open call, and not just very limited calls where only some people come to know about it. You need to really throw out this open calls to every academic organizations in the country. And if required, partner them. And I think that's a nice way to work, as I said. Create the centers around maybe different instrumentation concepts, one kind of instrument, or a broad, in a much more broader sense, an instrumentation lab where you can build different things with an academic or within an academic organization in partnership with a private organization. That that I think is really eventually building in two elements that is important for success. One is it brings in the knowledge that exists within the academic system. But we academicians are not very good at translating our minds into useful products. The private industry is very good at that, right? They would extract it out of you. So bring them together, and then you have a fantastic mix of different approaches where your chances of succeeding in delivering a product is much higher than if you just involve the academicians alone or the private industry alone. And as you rightly said, we often talk about it in multiple different conclaves, space conclaves and conferences, where everybody goes up and does their thing and say, oh yeah, it's extremely important, academia industry collaboration. But in the ground, very little happens. So I say create the centers everywhere with government funding and private funding, private players, the academic institution involved. Create multitude of them with different private industries, industrial partners involved.
I hope some of these are really coming into reality to a large extent. And what is your own center's road for some of this? Are there any specific things that you plan to do within your center to enhance or move this further when it comes to realization of instrumentation and so on?
Well, so the Center of Excellence in Space Sciences India, which I head at ISA Kolkata, we are already involved in the Aditya L1 space mission, which is India's first solar observatory. It's going to observe the sun and space weather. We are a co-investigator on the Solar Ultraviolet Imaging Telescope, which is being developed primarily at IUCA, which has been developed, and it's now ready for some testing, final testing before it's ready for flight. So that's the instrumentation part we are involved in. And as I said, we had engineers working for us. We had to let go of one engineer. We don't know what's going to happen to the other engineer after this project is over, because, as I said, when you don't really have an ecosystem, you're not involved in multiple space missions, you lose talent. You work hard to create them, but you can't retain them, and that's a bummer. So that's as far as the instrumentation story goes. We're not very sure whether we'll be able to sustain the instrumentation initiative that we started at ISA Kolkata in Center of Excellence in Space Sciences India, unless some miracle happens, frankly. Now, we also have this other initiative, which is developing space weather forecasting capability for India. And this we have been very successful. Ours is the only center which is now delivering space weather bulletins routinely. We analyze and assess space weather data and we put it up, all based on public data. But again, this is something that's done also by the United States NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center. It's also done by the UK Met and the European Space Agency's Space Weather Unit. What is not done is to tailor your space weather intelligence to specific user bases. Like, for example, launch providers to decide when they should be launching and particularly when they should not be launching, to satellite operators who work with GPS navigational network satellites, telecommunication satellites, to make them aware when you expect outages due to space weather events, to work with insurance companies who deal with the lifetime of satellites, as well as who underwrite satellites against extreme events like either a debris hit or extreme space weather event. This is not done by any of the public sector organizations. So public sector organizations are more in the business of assimilating the data, the model, and sending out these bulletins and making it available for the public. So this is something that I'm looking at of creating a business out of. Currently in India, everybody is encouraged to start a business. I think the science funding situation is such that we scientists are also being challenged to think of innovative ideas to make money, which is a good thing, I think, from my perspective. I'm not sure that how others feel about it. I think that fundamental science should always be funded, but I am in a domain of science where I started off looking at science from a very fundamental perspective. But then I have over years developed an expertise and a set of tools which can be applied to protect technologies in space. And I would like to take it to the outside world, not just in India, to everywhere, and see whether I can successfully integrate this knowledge with the needs of different users, starting from space agencies, defense, the industry players, and see if this actually is a proposition that is sustainable from the business perspective. So it's important, I think, that every scientist, everybody who creates knowledge, eventually think about this. That's a perspective that has grown on me over years of being just a scientist who was only worrying about publications. Because you see, I think at the end of the day, I'm at a level again where I need an additional challenge in my life, because I feel that I'm at that comfort zone where I can publish reasonably good papers which are reasonably well cited. And often we write in all these papers that my work is useful for the society. And most scientists pull that. But how many scientists actually go out and prove that your science is actually useful to the society? And what is the real test of that? The real test of that is not having a publication, by the way. The real test of that is in selling that to somebody whose life or whose technology depends on the advice or the intelligence that you're bringing in, or the product that you're bringing in. So that's the new challenge I want to take up. That's the new adventure I'm looking forward to.
It's fascinating, and good luck to you. And I hope more people think on these kinds of lines and not play the game of looking for just citations and things like this, but really looking at real world impact of the work that they do.
Thank you, Naran. I think it was a pleasure. Yeah. I opened my heart out to you, but then we have known each other for a long time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dibyendu, for taking the time. I hope to be obviously a part of knowing further what is the conclusion of all this kind of work and so on.
Absolutely. I think I've seen you how you have grown Search right from the grassroots, being very honest about how you went about doing it. No frills, no fancy, hard work. I admire where you have reached in 8 years. And of course, not just your own stuff. You have played such a nice umbrella. You've been such a nice umbrella to everybody in NewSpace India, to everybody who starts up in India. You're almost like an academician. I may have students. You have many students as well in the industry. So good luck to you as well, Narayan.
Oh, thank you so much for the kind words, Dibyendu. Thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share this episode with anyone you believe will enjoy listening to it. You'll be able to find the NewSpace India podcast in any of the podcasting platforms that you may be using, including Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Do subscribe to the podcast in case you want to receive new episodes automatically. I'm grateful if you're able to leave a rating for the podcast, which will help others discover it. Thank you for listening in again, and the next episode will be out in the next 2 weeks as usual.